It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sydney Mintz as our speaker today, our first speaker today. I actually have been hearing about Dr. Mintz, about Sid, for years now from my colleague over there, Ann Palmer, as I think she bills him as pretty much the best dinner companion she's ever had. So I had the pleasure of having dinner with Sid last week, and she was right. We had a great time. So you're in for a treat here. When I was getting together his biography, Pastor Chris said, well, just, he has a website and just Google him. So I Googled him yesterday, and well, let's just say I've never known anybody who's had so many web pages written about him, including a Wikipedia entry, which this is the first person I know with his own Wikipedia entry, although he contends that it's largely blown out of... Yeah, but I'm a little skeptical because he's done a lot of things. He's a professor of anthropology at Johns Hopkins. In fact, he helped found the anthropology department there in 1975. Prior to coming to Baltimore, he'd been on the faculty at Yale. He's also been a visiting professor at MIT, Princeton, Berkeley, the Collège de France, and in Germany, New Zealand, Australia, and Hong Kong, and continues to lecture and teach widely. So we have an expert lecturer on our hands today. He studied Caribbean rural life, social history, and the Afro-Caribbean tradition from the time of his first fieldwork in Puerto Rico in 1948 through his presentation of the W.E.B. Du Bois Lectures at Harvard in 2003. He's published several books and many articles and reviews. I had to scroll down. I stopped counting. It was taking too long. I think 300 or so. In 1956, his study of a sugarcane village became part of the people of Puerto Rico. In 1960, he published Worker in the Cane, the life story of a cane worker who came from that same village. He's done field work in Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic? Is that right? Jamaica. And Jamaica. In 1985, he wrote Sweetness and Power, which is concerned with the history of sugar worldwide. And more recently, he's been writing papers on the anthropology of food and researching the global role of soybeans and soy food while continuing his Caribbean work. So we are very pleased to have him here today. And I'm going to turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
I'm going to get turned on.
Yeah.
Today.
All right, here we go. I think you're in business.
Yes, I think I am. I am turned on. I apologize for using this mechanical device in order to speak with you, but I do so because I'm quite hoarse and I've been eating for breakfast nothing but cough drops. When I was first asked to undertake this adventure with you, I thought that food and faith referred quite specifically to a historical context, as a historical conjuncture. And so I had thought at first to talk about several incidents in the history of food and faith known to me with particular reference to food. And by way of examples, for instance, we're not going to get to it because I don't intend to take that up, but I thought to take several cases in which food served as the circumstantial context for violence over matters of faith. And the one that I have selected to end with in that little talk where I could give it was a man named Terence McSweeney, who was the Lord Mayor of Cork in the year 1920, who was arrested by the British because he carried, they said, seditious papers on his person, and confined at Brixton Prison for a period of 2 years, sentenced to 2 years. And McSweeney went to prison and started a hunger strike the same day. And the British discovered after a period of several weeks that they had put a target, because McSweeney not only fasted, but he lived. And he lived 74 days without food. He was a strong, healthy young man. And by the time he died on the 74th day, the whole world, even in those days, without the communication we got now, knew about Thanksgiving. Now, he died for his faith. His faith, in this instance, was political, more than religious. But he died over food. And I thought that would be a good story to end with, were I to give that lecture, but I'm not going to give it. I want today, if I can, to help us together to think about the relationship between food and faith, because I think that what I have to say will compel us to suppose that that relationship is a very ancient one, that predates not by hundreds or thousands of years, but by much more contemporary monotheistic religions with their food taboos. I want to suggest that the relationship between food and faith in the history of mankind goes back quite possibly 1 million years. And that we can't say anything very substantively about food and faith earlier than, say, 5,000 years ago. But I think that in order to understand what goes on in that 5,000 years, we have to know how long men have been men, that is, humans who've been humans, and take it into account in order to understand what culture is. And that's the second point that I want to make in what I have to say. To think about the idea that faith, of course, is a product of mind, but food in its own way is a product of mind as well. And that we need to understand for our species the capacity to think abstractly about all kinds of things that are insubstantial, but also about kinds of things that are very substantial indeed, like the food that we put in our mouths. I think that probably what I'm saying to you now is all platitudinous. You know it all, I'm sure. But I hope you'll excuse me because I'm going to try to breathe some more life into the same words. These products of the mind that I refer to are among the things that are covered by the word culture. And culture is what I want to spend 20 or so of my allotted time to talk about. But I may succeed by I may fail by trying to say too much, and if I succeed, it will be because I'm more laconic than I am normally. What you're going to be hearing is a precipitate of about 60 years of teaching, and it's awfully hard to condense whatever it is I've learned into 30 minutes. So I ask your tolerance. One reason that I want to talk about the concept of culture is because there's been a progressive vulgarization of what the word means, particularly in the last 50 or so years. I'm quite struck now, if you turn on a news program on TV or even in the newspapers, that people will use the word culture, for instance, to describe people on a bus. That they speak about the culture of the locker room. That they speak about culture is as if what the word meant were a temporary grouping of people who don't know each other very well. Now that's part of culture, just the way TV drama is also part of culture. But I think what these misconceptions or dilutions of the meaning of the concept mean is that the historical nature of culture is being lost. Now, the thing about it is, culture is not an easy word to define, and if you read the little paper that I suggested you passed around, you can see that it's hard to deal with it. Anthropologists are supposed to know about it, and they never really defined it. You say to a chemist, well, what is the core concept? And he says what it is, and you ask him to define it. If he can't define it, you think it must be nothing to chemistry. We have been arguing in my profession over the meaning of the word culture for probably 75 years, and we're still not sure. To define it is very difficult. It's easier to exemplify. I will give you a definition or two, but it's easier to give an illustration than to say what it is. But you know, that's not too different from life. It's much easier to exemplify life than to define it. Or matter. If someone asks, what's matter? Matter is a very difficult, the properties of matter are interesting, but it's very hard to define that. So I'm trying to suggest that there's a different level of conception, a different level of understanding involved in this word. that's entirely lost when we speak about the culture of the boardroom or whatever. The oldest and probably still very useful definition of culture is the kind of, you can't define it so you surround it definition. It comes from the work of an eminent British anthropologist who was really late 19th century, early 20th century, Edward Burnett Tyler. I'll read it slowly. Culture or civilization, and those two words used that way is immensely important the way he has to say it. Culture or civilization is equally the property of our species. Culture or civilization, taken in its broad ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. The important things in that definition are, first of all, culture or civilization. What he means by that, though he doesn't say it, is that a group of people living in some jungle who wear breechclouts and get their food with bows and arrows have it exactly the way we have it. Not differently. They have it. They have that capacity exactly the same. That their mental organization, their powers of thought are not in any sense different from ours. So he culture or civilization, and then defines it for both. And at the end, where he says, acquired by man, meaning man and woman, as a member of society. Now, when we think about it in detail, rather the way he thinks about it, a particular human individual can wear a shirt or a breechclout. He can be a Baptist and not a Catholic. He can speak English and not German. He can sing the blues, not a Maori war chant. He can hoe cotton rather than grow yams. He can eat collard greens rather than sauerkraut. All of it is part of culture. All of it is part of culture. Then what is not culture? In the case of the individual, it's all behavior and the results of that behavior that's determined by instinct or by the autonomic nervous system. All of those things that we share with other species is not culture. Those not shared things take on more meaning when we put them in the context of Tyler's definition of learning as a member of society. They implicate the curious fact about us is that we have an enormously long childhood. All mammals have longer childhoods than other species because all mammals have to do some learning. But relatively speaking, ours is the longest, and we have the smallest litters because more time is needed to become an adult human. That is the case for instance, my cat, Marco, who had his first birthday yesterday. He's all grown up. We have a long infancy because we need a long infancy. But the idea of putting stress on social learning when you talk about culture comes to mean that it's not so much defining culture as making clear how culture comes to be, how it comes to grow, how it takes on a characteristic form. And for most social scientists, and particularly psychologists, but for most social scientists, that's enough. Culture is social learning, that what you learn as a member of society. It's not enough. I don't think it's good enough. I don't think it covers enough. I think culture is more complicated than that and needs a little more attention. So I'm going to use two adjectives that come from one of my teachers and colleagues long ago about which he and others made great fuss. And they're in that article if you've read it, but I'd like to go over some of the same ground if you would excuse me. The two words are super organic and super individual. They're strange words. Because of the properties of culture, the properties of matter, like the properties of life, because of the properties of culture, its transmissibility, its high variability, its sometimes curious tendencies to accumulate, to pile up, to increment in some way, which I will illustrate. Because of its frequent emphasis on values about correctness or inquiry, because of its ongoing influence on individuals, because of those features of culture, it pushes our humanity to a somewhat different level that cannot be fully explained by reference to the individual human organism. And that's what part of what is meant by super-organic and super-individual. Super-individual in the fact that there are things about cultures, I will show you, that cannot be explained by reference to us as individuals, that are external to us, that are extra-organic, outside us in some important, and yet they're there. I will try to make sense of what I'm telling you now. I don't mean that culture somehow floats above us like a cloud, nor is it comparable to some of the conceptions of the soul. That's not what I have in mind. It cannot be reduced to its physical, its animate, or even its psychological level of explanation. That's what I'm trying to say. It can't be pushed down in the same way that you can't take life and say you've explained it thoroughly by reference to inert matter. You can't take culture and push it down and say it's explained by reference to the human individual. What is learned does not become part of the inherent human organic endowment. It's external in some important way, significant way, to what we are at the level of animal species. The institutions, the practices, and the ideas of a particular culture have some kind of persistence. They can be conceived of, I conceive of them, as having an existence that's somehow outside of and above people themselves. And the ideas that are part of culture can be diffused to other human beings, from one place to another, from one individual to another, without any organic change. They are, as it were, freed in some way from our organic existence. Let me leave all this theoretical talk and get back to contemporary life, because I think it's easier to illustrate, as I said at the outset, with examples. And I only have two. Take a religion. It can be Catholicism or any other, but if you take a religion. Religions that have died, that have disappeared, often leave massive evidence of their significance for the people who practice them, as we know from ruins around the Earth's surface. But if we take a living religion, its represented physical, corporeal representation is enormous. If you think of the cathedrals, the works of art, the Bach music, the painting, the incense, the whole, all of the priesthood. If you think about an institution of this kind and its enormous extent and importance, its influence worldwide, you realize that its personnel moves through it. One is born, one is baptized, one takes communion, one reaches adulthood and marries, one grows old, one dies. So people pass through this, as it were. But the fact that human mortality does not affect the continuity of this institution. There is something about that institution that plainly lies outside our individual existence. And this is what I'm trying to say, this quality of culture, its transmissibility, its tendency to accumulate. This is what I'm trying to talk about. But let me leave that one and give what I take to be probably a better example, though it's a little harder, a little more difficult perhaps to explain. It's language. And you will see as I tell it to you that I'm trying to draw a line of a sort to which I'll return that line. If we take English, each of us takes our language as we get it. Every normal human is born with the capacity to learn to speak. But as we grow, the language we learn from the people around us. Ungrammatical, grammatical, with this accent or with that, whatever. We learn. We start small. Part of the price of growing up is learning that language. And that's the language that we learn. But the language we're learning, we can give very little back to. Even if you're a great playwright or a great you can never give back to English what English has given to you. Not even Shakespeare. And what you're speaking is the condensation of many thousands of years of people speaking that language, and that language is a product in some important way of those preceding millennia. And that process, it results in not only transmissibility, people who learn it who are not primarily English speakers, but also in accumulation in the way that it piles up. What we get is the version that our relatives and friends speak around us as we grow. Can you begin to see then what the words superorganic and superindividual mean, at least as I am using them? The language is so much bigger than any single speaker. And there are characteristics to language that I can't go into here, but that are very important. There's the phrase drift. Some of you may have noticed in the past 10 years at most, a shift in American English to something of a, kind of a. There's a shift in it, and it's there. Nobody knows where it came from. When these things take over, they take over by themselves. They're in the language. We all speak it, and we see it change as we speak it. Now, this is an important example of culture for me, particularly because the capacity to speak is innate, inherent, instinctive, built in. We come with that. It shows up, and I could describe it. The children babble. At first they babble randomly, then they begin to babble with the phonemes of their parents. I mean, we know how that happens. But they speak languages, and the languages have to be learned. If the language is plenty, if we all spoke the same language, that would be instinctive too. But since we do not, what we are speaking is a historical product of humans. And one way to say it is that every living creature has a natural history. So do we. But alongside that natural history is a history that was made by us. And we did it through this substance, this material called culture. Now, the division I talked about earlier and want to refer to yet again because it turns up in various forms of what I say, and I think I'm about to finish very soon, I haven't got the food yet, is that on the one hand, you have those features which are built in and structurally determined, like the capacity to speak. And on the other, you have the product, if you will, of that capacity, all of which is a historical product, all of which is learned. And the the superorganicity or the extraorganicity of what I'm saying has to do with the fact that the languages we learn are all, from the point of view of the linguist, the same. They're all equally complex. They're all equally difficult. From the point of linguistics, you cannot rank those languages. You can't say Zulu is inferior to Bantu or English is superior to both. Makes no sense. Has nothing to do with where you live. It has nothing to do with your nationality, with your color. Those things are totally irrelevant to what I'm talking about. So the capacity to speak is species-wide. It's a characteristic of humans. And anthropologists spend their lives saying over and over again, no, those people are not inhuman. No, those people are not subhuman because they don't have Kalashnikovs. They are not inferior. That culture is an equal property of all human beings. And it's a property because we're historical creatures. We're the only creature who can bind time, who can tie present and past together by the way we use communication. I don't want to get into the history of the culture at greater length than that because I think we don't have the time for it. But we've come at last. I'm supposed to wave my hands calmly now. We've come at last to the two trees. After you saw the two trees, has everybody seen the two trees? If not, let's give the two trees now. The two trees, the picture of the two trees comes from an old textbook by this same colleague and teacher whom I greatly admire, Alvin Lewis Kroeber. And he plays a little trick on us with the picture as we speak. There's a little bit of humor involved in it. It's a very simple picture. There's a little bit of humor, I think. How much time
As much as you need. As much as you need.
I would do this in 29 minutes. I was warned by Aunt Palmer that after 30 minutes, this long hook comes out. These two trees, one is called the tree of life, and the other is called the tree of culture. That is of knowledge of good and evil. That's the little bit of humor that Kroger is putting in for us. But of course, it is intentional. It isn't humorous. It's serious. No creature but us has a moral sense. And you'll notice that the tree on the right is very obviously a tree of heat. But the branches can double back on each other, and an Eskimo's joined. It doesn't look like a tree, it looks like a weird tree, or like a tree combined with a vine. The tree on the left is the tree of life. The tree of life always proliferates, nothing turns back. Species cannot turn back on themselves. And they can't, they're not interfered at the levels, specifically. They're not able to. What you end up with the jackass. There is no doubling back in life. Life constantly ramifies out. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of human culture, the branches double back on themselves. They cross over. The Romans were deeply influenced by the Greeks. Both were deeply influenced by Egypt. The history of man has been a history of trading back and forth, of continuous social intercourse. And it goes for everything. It goes for inventions. It goes for child training. It goes for food habits. It goes, of course, for religion. So this second tree is us. And it's not a tree. It's not an organic tree. Nothing in it gets into our genes. It's a tree that's completely separate from our capacity to reproduce. That's our animal capacity to reproduce. But none of this stuff gets in there. It's all external, extra-organic, outside. And yet it has enormous influence over us as we grow in every way. Now we're not talking about a group of people around the fountain at the coffee break. This is no longer the culture of the locker room. Now we're talking about something that's important about our social life. That refers to us as a species. And the boundary I was drawing is the boundary that separates one tree from the other, that keeps these trees apart. Just as, I might say, the capacity for language is different from the languages we speak. The capacity is in the tree on the left. The languages we speak are in the tree on the right. So this is a very important kind of distinction, I think, for understanding the human animal. An animal we are. An animal we're classified. But we're something, obviously something much more than that. That same line separates what we look like from what we speak. And this is one of the most important discoveries of all, principles of anthropology discovered by really the first professional anthropologist in the United States, not the first anthropologist, but the first academic one, Franz Boas, that his most important lesson was that race, language, and culture are completely separate kinds of phenomena. And what I've been trying to suggest, and I hope I've managed to do it at least in a meager way, is that when we talk about culture, we're talking about a level of phenomena very different from the psychological. And of course very different from the organic or animate, and very different from matter. It includes all of those things, but it's a different level. You can't reduce it. When I get up in the morning and put on a shirt rather than the toga, it has to be explained by my culture. And if you say, but what then do you mean? What you mean is it has to be explained by some other cultural fact, which has to do with the history of clothing and other things in the society in which I live. It's a shortcut, logically, of course, to say that what explains it, why I put on a shirt is culture. That does. but it can be explained in the context of cultural materials, and I do it without thinking. This is part of what I wanted to say. I'll make one other point, and then I'll talk 2 minutes about food. Maybe 3. There'll be semicolons in my sentence. If we think once again about the distinction between the 2 trees, and then I say to you that in the history of the human species, we've had experts who can tell us about how the length of the gut influences bowel movements, or how we can't eat cellulose, but we can certainly do well with oranges. If we get nutritionists or physiologists or internal medicine, medical specialists who tell us about us as eaters, they can give us an enormous amount of helpful detail about how we should eat, how we could eat, how we did eat, how we will eat, all that stuff. They can't tell us anything about what we eat. And what we eat has been, for, I would say, at a minimum 40,000 years, but probably for much longer, as much a historical product as language. And I think that is because we add to our ability to communicate in this very economical, symbolic form, this wondering economy, which is language, tight little device that we can use. I'm saying sentences I've never said before, and you can all understand them. I mean, if I'm clear enough, you can understand them. They've never been said before. Language is, we have like 14 phonemes, or 15, maybe 20 phonemes in English, that's all. We constantly manufacture sentences that have never been said before. All of us can do it. We're equally wonder workers. And it's true of every language. And it's completely human, and it's extra-organic. And in the same way, I guess comparably, I should say, the food we've been eating have been man-made products for, anyway, 40,000 years, probably much more. And I'll try to explain it. The difference between what we come with, which is an appetite and a gut, the difference between what we come with and what we eat is the difference between the capacity to speak and the languages we speak. One is the tree of life and the other is the tree of culture. Now, to talk about food a little more serious. The only food we now eat that I think can be defensively called natural is mother's milk. In my opinion, there's no other food we can fairly refer to as natural. But of course, the word natural isn't regulated by anybody. It's used for all kinds of terrible garbage that's stuffed in little tin bags and sold to us. So, but the only natural food we have is mother's milk, simply because we add to that capacity for using language the fact that we're related in our ancestry to we're primates, and much more we're hominidae. Our closest living relatives are the chimpanzee and the bonobo. They're very anciently related, 28 billion years ago. So, but we do have from them, as so many mammals do, certain features that are useful. One is the 5-digit hand, which used to be a foot, but became a hand because we hung in trees and opposable thumb was the other side. And you can or cannot believe that, but it's true. You know that the whale's flipper you know that the whale's flipper has 5 digits. You know that the bat's wing has 5 digits. They're all mammals. We're closely related more to some of them than to others. They all have small litters. They all have relatively long childhoods. But when we get to us, in addition to that capacity, we fiddle with material. And you see it in apes, in great apes. You can see it foreshadowed in the great apes. This business of picking up a leaf and putting it near an anthill, and as the ants come out, picking it up and eating them off, and then putting it in a leaf. You can see that thrust, and of course in us it becomes so powerful, to manipulate the universe, to put something between us and nature. And we all do it. And that's incremental too. That's also accumulated. I'll tell a quick story. I can't resist telling you this quick story. There was a German psychologist who spent years in Africa studying the behavior of chimpanzees during World War I. And he was interned there in enemy alien where he studied, so he was there for 5 years. He got to know those apes very well. He did all kinds of experiments. The experiments were wonderful. The book's still available if you want to read it. I'll give you the details. But in this study that he did of these apes, he developed a box. And it was a box that had no top and was open on one side. So you could look into it if it was this way. If you turned it around, you could still look in it. You would peer over it, but it would have the back part to it. And he used those boxes with the apes. He discovered that when the box was facing the ape, so that it was open in front, the ape could pull the food out with a stick this way. They liked it. When he turned it around, so that they had to imagine pushing the food away from them before they could then rake it toward them. They didn't like that. Not all of them could learn that. I was at that. 18-month-old human child, the apes have problems with it, and push it away, and then pull it out. But he worked with those apes very carefully, and he got them to do all kinds of experiments for him. He gave them a stick to rake the food in. Then he made the stick in 2 parts, and he produced a ferrule. He had a male and female ferrule on the stick together. So the ape, in order to use it, had to fit in it. They learned how to do that. They would put them together, then get the food. And he made it more complicated. One ape was really smart, Sultana, I think, female ape, he put the 2 sticks in, but the bigger stick didn't fit in the ferrule. So the ape had to take it with his teeth, cut it off, so it would wear off, fail, and the ape did it. One ape managed to do that. So there's that thrust to manipulate the environment. Well, the reason I'm telling you about these apes is because I'm going to imagine a daddy ape and 2 baby apes, a son and a daughter who are out in the woods, and they've got these 2 sticks they can fit together. And they're using it to rake in the bananas. And the boy says to his daddy, "Oh, Dad, if you had a friction ring that you could push down over that joint, it would be much more stable." And the old man says, "Pretty smart, kid, I never thought of that." And the daughter, even smaller, said, "Yeah, Dad, and after you put on the friction ring, if you drill a hole through, you can drop a pin in, and it'll really be stable." The only problem is what these apes can't do. We can do that. Children can tell their parents how to build things, as parents tell their children how to build things. And neighbors can tell them how to build things, because culture is transmissible. And so there is this combination of skills, and there are many more, but this combination of skills that rest in our inherent organic capacity and are detached from it by our activity. First of all, the language, and second, the tool making, have a lot to do with the way culture assumes its characteristic super-individual, super-organic form. You can imagine the effect of these kinds of capacities, the driving forces, language and tool making combined in terms of food. The first really significant such difference, of course, was the mastery of fire. First learning to use it, then learning to control it so it could be put out and lit again. It's very old, but we don't know whether it's 40,000 years or 300,000. We don't know, and it may be 1.3 million. But somewhere so long ago that we can't imagine it. I mean, we think 1,000 years is so long, but yet hominids were around at least 1/8, maybe 2.3 million years ago. Who can imagine 1 million years? And we've been human ever since these kinds of skills became part of the life of our species. Well, in the case of food, fire made it possible for human beings to convert lots of the plants among which they lived, which they knew, into food that they could not have otherwise eaten. Well, the first instance that a human was able to take grain or tubers or sweet potatoes, and remember, we're not talking about domestication, I haven't got to that yet, to turn those things into daily food. There was no longer natural food. And the human got whispered it. 12,000 or so years ago, man, for the first time, domesticated plants and animals. And the history of domestication could take another 30 minutes or another 30 years to tell because it's so marvelous. There were no Aggie schools. There were no scientists in white coats. We didn't have Monsanto. But the men and women who developed genetics first
by breeding plants and animals were those on the... We know who invented the hula hoop. We have no idea who domesticated maize, who that person was. We don't know who gave rice to the world. All of these marvelous things that are part of our past that we enjoy, that were done for us by unknown ancestors, and done by men and women who just did these things. They didn't need PhDs. You know, they just went ahead and did it. And they learned these amazing things about genetics and about plants and animals, about nature. They did it for us. All of those things that they did long ago, about 12,000 years ago, were processes. They weren't events. Nobody invented domestication. Someone tamed animals and fed probably babies, and then discovered it would be possible to keep animals. And the three most important things about domestication is you restrict the territory of the domesticated. Then you change its food. And then you control its reproductivity. Those are the three things that turn wild things into domesticated things. And this was done by different people in different parts of the Earth's surface, and they didn't have Kleenex, and they didn't have dictionaries, and they were able to do all of these things, and they did it independently in this place. But of course, once they did travel back and forth. People learned about these things, and the ideas traveled, and the plants traveled. So the history of human food is a history, among other things, of this enormous energy that was released long ago in our history as human beings, and still definitely affects very significantly how we eat and what we eat. I think that I'll just say two more things and stop reading. The first is I could rave on in this way forever, and talking about human achievements in the sphere of food. I'm writing a paper now on fermentation, and I'm having such a good time and learning so much, and it's so amazing. And as parts of it, I'll just mention one thing from a guy named Mohammed Dirar has written a book about the fermented foods of Sudan. You know about the Sudan, you know what condition is Sudan. So I have to tell you about Sudan. He documents ethnographically in his book 80 different fermented foods that are eaten by Sudanese people that they themselves prepare. And it's so amazing to think of all of that knowledge never been recorded. Why would anybody want to put down the trash that these people eat? The only difference is so this wonderful record of the way people can do things and do it for themselves. And of course, for us, it's all like sauerkraut. What's so special about sauerkraut? Sauerkraut is an amazing achievement because it's fermentation carried out by microorganisms. You have to know which microorganism, otherwise you get something rots that you think rots. So I won't go on to, but there is so much more to be said about that. But let me say in concluding that food, because it is so important to our species, has been overloaded symbolically, and we may want to get into some of that in the questions. But I used to say to my classes that the most powerful drive in our species is hunger. And of course, young adolescents, I would say to them, of course, you probably think that the sexual drive is more powerful. That's because you're well-fed and young. But if you try fasting for 36 hours, tell me how sexy you feel. Food is that important because it's so important. Because it's as important as sexuality in human life, and in other ways, put otherwise, much more urgent in its demands upon us. Because of that, it's going to be symbolically overloaded in every way. It's going to be used a lot symbolically. That's about, I think, where I should stop. Otherwise, I get back to Terence McSween. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jim. Time for 2 questions? A couple questions? Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes.
I remember from an earlier speaker a rather, what seemed to be a shocking comment at the time, that something like 92 or 94% of all of the food that is sold in the U.S. these days is processed, by which I presume now she meant lots of additives, or that you take food from the field or whatever and you put lots of chemicals in it. But what I'm hearing from you is that everything except for milk is processed.
Well, everything including milk is processed.
Yeah.
If you mean subjected to some mechanical experience. The only things that are not are fresh fruits and vegetables, which we continue not to sell in poor minority neighborhoods. And fresh fruit, they can't make any fruit. There's no added value to potatoes. And so they want to put things in packages as much as they can. But what I'm talking about is not, it's something other than processing. I'm trying to say that once food is manipulated mechanically by man, and that must come very early in the human record, it's no longer quite natural. Whales know what to eat. Even pigs know perfectly well what to eat, and if you don't get the truffle away from him, he'll eat it too. All those animals know what to eat. We don't know what to eat. Now, there was a time when we did, but there's been some loss of hormonal controls in the history of our species, so that we no longer know. They used to conduct these experiments 25 years ago, letting little babies crawl around on the rug and have all kinds of food after them, because some nutty secret said the babies are going to know what's good for them. Well, not only the babies don't know what's good for them, their parents don't know what's good for them. We're the only species that not only doesn't know what to eat, but deliberately eat things that will kill us. Like oysters from poisoned water, mushrooms in Europe. Every year, 30 people die from mushrooms in Europe, picking mushrooms. They cook them. I never knew it was nominated, and you drop dead, So here we have fugu. The Japanese like fugu, the blowfish that's deadly, to kill themselves. The only species that thinks that's part of life. You eat food that will kill you. I mean by processing something much broader in general, that is touched by tool makers' hands. Cooking is the best illustration. So that's so dramatic. If you think of cereal grasses, which you could chew on a human being and you could swallow some of them, but they would be very hard to digest. And I don't think people did that much. Roots and tubers, some of those you can eat raw, but in general they're very hard on the gut. Turning all of those things, or to take a quite different example, the domestication and use of cassava. Cassava contains trace gluten, it's deadly. Why take a portion of plant and turn it into your food? Our food-related behavior simply doesn't conform to the behavior of all other species, which know exactly what to eat. Bears know what to eat. True, they'll eat garbage if they can't get to their food, but then they eat garbage. But they know what to eat, not us. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I wish we could spend several nights and eat lots of meals with you.
I could do better.
But tell me, you've given us an illustration of some trees. I'd like you to locate the trees in a forest. And one of the things that really interests me is how the lines between cultures are not necessarily porous, and an enormous amount of energy goes into separating one culture from another. I'd love to hear you talk more about part of the symbolic overload has to do with establishing boundaries. If you could talk a little bit about how that plays out vis-a-vis food or initial reactions, because I know that would take us semesters to unravel.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll try to address it at least briefly. My personal view of culture is a definition of it should contain the idea, at least, that different cultures, as opposed to culture as a property of the species, produce different visions of reality. So that one could almost say, I'd be inclined to say, that if you think of human society as having evolved into groups out of an original commonality of some kind, that as those groups took shape, each one of them had a different take on what nature was. And that's one reason why it's difficult to achieve general comprehension of the world. Some things seem to resist very stubbornly common understanding. And there's all kinds of dramatic examples, but there's simple examples too, about the inability to understand and how words aren't translatable. But I think beyond that, your point is that various kinds of things can be used by peoples, by different peoples, to indicate who is and who isn't. And of course, food is a very powerful marker of that kind. One of the things that people do with food all the time is send signals with it. Mary Douglas used to make the point that food is a form of can be a form of communication. And it's perfectly true. If you drink carrot juice at the same table in the college dorm every day, you're sending a very clear message, you know. Of course, carrot juice has a real punch about it, just the way a big porterhouse does. So we're constantly sending messages with food. And groups send messages about food by proscription and prescription. I don't think there's ever been a group of humans known to anthropology that lacked food taboos. Every people I know about has food taboos. And the taboos, of course, have nothing to do with reality, usually. Young women can't eat squash when squash is in blossom. Old men are the only ones who can get intoxicated. That's a good rule. It's a real rule. Women can't eat eggs. You know, once they're pregnant, can't eat eggs, or after. So there's all of this baloney that people think of for indicating who they are. And of course, I think all the rules of monotheism are precisely for that purpose. I think that's the main reason that they exist, is because they say, we do this and we're we, and you don't do that and you're not we. And that's what the rules are for. I think probably the first time that we can imagine human groups meeting, they would notice each other's hair and other external features, but hair in particular. And they would notice if there was any clothing, what kinds of clothing they had. And if they had a half hour with those people, the next thing they notice is what they eat. Look, they eat the head of the worm. We know only the tail of the worm is worth eating. I mean, that's what people do. So it is, of course, an enormously powerful marker. And I think it's a marker in a different way. Margaret Drabble has this character who is enormously successful in business, but late at night when he goes home, and he's in a five-star restaurant, and he had a date with a movie star, he gets home, he takes out of the refrigerator or off the shelf a can of condensed milk and boils it, and then opens it and eats it with a spoon, because that's what he had when he was a baby, a little boy. I mean, I can't leave, what's it called? The little rabbits that you get at Easter. You know, the marshmallow.
Peeps.
I can't resist peeps. I couldn't have any candy when I remember my first peep was marbles. The way we live our childhood with the food, because food is, among other things, so popular. But yeah, I think the boundary drawing and the business of we are and you aren't is very powerful. And of course, it's not only we are and you aren't, but we are and you eat lousy food. It comes along.
Well, thank you so